Hello everyone. So before we proceed to our discussion, let me introduce first my group number and my co-member. So obviously we are the group 7 and my co-members are Nova Don Barrete, Marjorie Bansag, Christian Labajo and Clint Mabao and also me, Chavi Faith R. Carzado. So today we will be discussing the article entitled Post-Harvest Food Losses, the Neglected Dimension in Increasing the World Food Supply. So, for this slide, it shows the food pipeline wherein um, it discusses the process of the food from the producer up to the consumer. So as you can see from this illustration, it shows of how the product is lost during the process up to the consumer. So from the producer, it produces quantity of commodities, but then when it is undergo to different stages or different scenario wherein it includes pre-processing, transport, storage, processing and packaging and marketing, there are many factors that contribute to the losses of food, which will resulted to the lower quantity of commodity to the consumer. So this explains that as the food losses increases, the commodity consumed by the consumer also decreases. So for this slide, we will be defining what is post-harvest losses is. So when we say post-harvest, it is the process of collecting or separating food of edible quality from its immediate production. But then when we say loss, it is the any change of availability, edibility, wholesomeness, and or quality of the food that prevents the consumer to consume the said commodity. However, when we say food losses, it can be direct or indirect. When we say direct, it is the disappearance of food due to spillage or consumption of the rodents or birds. So, in simple terms, direct food losses focuses on the pre-harvest losses that occurs before the processing of harvesting begins. For example, losses in growing crops due to insect, weeds, and rust. However, when we say indirect food losses, it is the losses due to mechanical or physical damage because of the bruising, abrasion, defective seal of cans, excessive or insufficient heat or cold, and improper temperature that may resulted to losses of food that resulted to the consumer to refuse the commodity.
Where does losses occur? Losses may occur in any of this situation from preparation to home preparation up to the extent losses. So, preparation, this is the preliminary separation or extraction of edible from non-edible animal and agricultural production. For example, the hulling of grain, slaughtering and dressing of animals, extraction of sugar from sugarcane, and peeling of fruits and vegetables. So, preservation. Preservation is the prevention of loss and spoilage of foods. For example, the drying of grain or fruit, the refrigeration or canning of vegetables or fish, and the prevention of the onset of rancidity in oil. In processing, it is the conversion of edible food into another form or more acceptable or more convenient to the consumer. For example, the making of bread from wheat, brewing beer from barley, making sausage from meat, and making instant coffee from coffee beans. In storage, it is the holding of foods until consumption for perishable foods such as fish, meat, and dairy products. And in transportation, most developing countries need an improved transportation system to reduce the time lag between the site of production and the market. And in home preparation, in developed countries, there is considerable use of foods in the home. For example, studies in Denver have shown that the average American household discards approximately 10% of the food that has been purchased. All mentioned situation can be one of the reasons to have extant losses.
This section can be subdivided into two parts. First is the commodities that should be given attention in post-harvest food loss reduction program. The second one is the activities that should be given consideration. So commodities is the majority organization that conduct activities in the area of post-harvest food loss reduction devote their efforts largely or wholly to reducing losses in grains and dry legumes. This attitude is probably based upon the fact that the cereals and dry legumes are staple foods and contribute a major part of the calorie and protein intake of population in developing countries. So for this consideration in mind, a useful apportionment of effort in post-harvest food loss reduction funding would probably be approximately as follows. First is the cereals and dry legumes, 60%, roots and tubers, 20%, selected list of perishable, 20%.
There are things need to consider to minimize food losses. Number 1, equipment. In developing nations, numerous food storage and handling facilities are clearly required. This includes grain storage facilities that can be as small as on-farm storage facilities or as large as elevators and terminals, depending on the requirement of each location. It is also necessary to construct general-purpose warehouses for storing goods other than grains for a portion of the year. Numerous regions require additional refrigeration storage capacity. In developing nations, the dehuling and milling of cereals, particularly rice, frequent result is significant food loss. Research into improved methods and equipment for threshing, dehuling, and milling grain, particularly in small operation, and assistance in the acquisition of a new, more efficient equipment are all needed to improve the efficiency of dehuling and milling operation in developing nations. Number 2, education. It is important to note that developed countries know how to control food losses after harvest, but that developing nations don't. In order to educate population in developing nations about the fact that large post-harvest losses in food are not inevitable, that there are known causes for losses, and that there are known cures for each cause of loss. A significant educational effort across the entire social spectrum is required. It will be necessary to dispel superstitious and erroneous beliefs in some areas, such as the notion that stored foodstuffs naturally produce insects. The entire population of developing nations ought to be aware that stored food is not inert like a stockpile of metal or lumber that can be stored indefinitely and left without care. Instead, stored food is a living biological system that requires constant monitoring to maintain its quality and availability. Food that has been stored needs to be cared for by knowledgeable individuals with appropriate facilities for proper operations. Large storage facilities especially require trained personnel. Number 3. Adaptive research. Even though the fundamentals of food preservation and storage are well known and the technology is well developed in developed nations, it is necessary to develop low-cost, simple technology packages that will seamlessly integrate with its nation's existing practices and traditions. The majority of this work ought to be country-specific, taking into account the existing incentives for farmers and food handlers to adopt the new package, local building materials, and customs. It is important to work out each part of the absolute bundle exhaustively and look at in it. Practice before it is shown on a wide scale. It would be waste everyone's time and money to rush into implementing a new recommended practice that hasn't been thoroughly tested in its locality. In adaptive research, the drying and storage of grains need to be given a lot of attention. Although a significant number of small-scale storage facilities have been described, more research is required, with an emphasis on economic considerations. Number 4. Basic research. In order to create new technologies that can solve specific problems faced by developing nations, basic research is necessary in a select few areas. In order to make significant advances, this will necessitate providing a single center of excellence in each area of interest with long-term funding commitments ranging from 5 to 20 years. Because of the relevance, the potential to reduce post-harvest food loss, basic research is needed in the following areas. Number 5. Loss surveys. In-country surveys to determine typical figures are desirable because there is lack of hard data on the extent of food losses, their economic dimensions, and the cost of reducing them. Planning successful large-scale intervention program requires this kind of data. And the last one, literature research. The issue of food spoilage on farms was given a lot of attention in the early days of by the state experiment stations and the US Department of Agriculture. Through the extension services, easy ways for farm families to cut down on food losses were developed and made available to farmers. The American farm family no longer has to raise and prepare nearly all over their own food because of modern transportation, marketing, and supermarkets. In some of the older publications of these previously mentioned agencies, there ought to be useful information that would be applicable to developing nations. It would be worthwhile to go through this old literature to find it, bring it up to date in light of what we know about food.
The following formula shows how to calculate the production needed to supply a fixed quantity of consumable grain after a certain percentage in the post-harvest system. So the formula is production equals amount of consumable grain times 100% over 100 minus percentage of post-harvest loss. So, if the amount of consumable grain needed is 100 tons, this formula becomes, so required production equals 100 tons times 100% over 100% minus percent post-harvest losses.